There comes a turning point in everyone's life when they realize the need to free themselves from the shackles of other people's expectations. Endless explanations, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the convenience of others, the blurring of one's own boundaries. All this is gradually becoming a thing of the past. One day, without unnecessary words and warnings, a transformation takes place. It is not the transformation into an unfeeling egoist, but the acquisition of clarity in understanding your own needs and priorities. There is no longer a need for rudeness or confrontation. There is a quiet but decisive dismissal of the person who constantly seeks to please others, without compensation or severance pay. And this is where the fun part begins. The confusion of those who are used to unfettered access to your time, energy, and emotions. They find themselves at a loss to understand how you suddenly became unavailable. Before, they could turn to you at any time, counting on your support and understanding. But the most surprising thing is that you didn't have to block anyone, make scandals, or leave spectacularly. You simply became inaccessible, and that silence proved far more eloquent than any words. You are no longer a fail-safe machine that is always ready to say yes. One stops wasting mental energy on those who disappear the moment support is required of them. Acquiring the status of unattainable is not manipulation, but a matter of principles. It is a way of life in which the individual no longer seeks the fleeting warmth of casual connections. It is not a matter of avoiding intimacy, but of ending a period of having to settle for little from those one has outgrown. It is at this point that life becomes truly interesting. In the ability to remain unperturbed lies an amazing power. And this is not a game of mystery or unapproachability to attract attention. It's more than that. It's about transcending the old self that constantly needed validation, understanding, and protection. Becoming unattainable means not only physical inaccessibility, but also a loss of control over one's emotional reactions. Previously, when faced with being ignored, a person could spend hours or even days analyzing the situation, composing long messages, and rereading old correspondence. Often, a person spends time on fruitless discussions, vainly trying to realize his own mistakes and miscalculations. However, there comes a point when the silence of others becomes a valuable gift, reminding us that true self-worth does not require constant proof. It is rooted in the realization of one's own worth. As soon as the individual stops making excuses and explaining his or her actions, something amazing happens. Others begin to show their true selves without the need to manipulate or control the situation. Some people disappear from this person's life, and this is for the best, as their role in his fate has been exhausted. Others, on the other hand, make desperate efforts to return to his environment, driven less by genuine love than by a reluctance to lose access to his resources and attention. Access is notoriously addictive, and when it is no longer readily available, people begin to treat it with greater care and respect, realizing its true value. That value is the person. Perhaps for the first time in his life, the individual feels it not in a quest for attention, but in a quiet and confident self-sufficiency. He no longer needs the approval of others to keep moving forward. Not only his gait changes, but also his very breathing, filled with confidence and calmness. The man indulges in a well-deserved rest without remorse. He does not consider it his duty to respond to every message, nor does he rush to fix someone else's emotional turmoil. He no longer resembles a sponge, absorbing other people's troubles and misfortunes. This is not a manifestation of anger or resentment, but rather a state of inaccessibility to everything that disturbs his mental balance. And this is not coldness, but a natural stage of personality development. The surrounding world begins to notice these changes. Those who previously took his presence for granted now try to solve it like a complex puzzle. The truth is, however, that they never really deserved his attention. There comes a point when a person stops looking for answers to everything and begins to enjoy the silence that follows. He realizes that not everything in life has to have an explanation. He no longer needs to wait for apologies from those who are mired in their own illusions, or demand explanations from those who are incapable of honesty. He doesn't even need to be noticed, for he has already recognized himself. This is exactly what those around him didn't expect. Having become inaccessible, he no longer acts out of desperation. The man moves forward, not turning away from those around him, but leaving behind fruitless conversations that circle around the same closed circle. He does not avoid communication, but simply comes to a deep understanding of himself and realizes how rarely others have shown such understanding towards him. You may hear from the outside that he has changed, becoming more aloof and withdrawn. It is noted that he writes less often, doesn't respond as quickly, and doesn't show up as often as he used to. And it's true. He no longer behaves like a help desk operator, ready to solve other people's problems at the drop of a hat, forgetting about his own needs. There's no room for ranting or dramatic defriending. There is no need to explain anything. A person simply begins to choose himself, doing it quietly and gradually. He learns to say no without making excuses, allows himself to rest without guilt, and laughs at things that used to ruin his whole day. His presence becomes valuable not because of a desire for exclusivity, but because he finally realizes the true cost of gratuitously wasting himself on everyone. One stops wondering if he is missed. There is no longer the naive hope of a possible return, because the person who desperately needed such affirmation is in the past. There comes a period when one's surroundings become more meaningful than one's approval, and loneliness feels like a more fulfilling state than fake, superficial connections. It is at this point that life begins to attract new people, opportunities, and the very world that previously had to be chased exhaustingly. There is no need to prove anything. It is enough just to be yourself. In the process of becoming unattainable, it is important to understand that the essence lies not only in the refusal of certain actions, but also in the active defense of personal boundaries. A person begins to protect their lost positions, that inner peace that arises when there is no immediate need to check the phone, waiting for someone's attention. The practice of waking up as a fireman, rushing to extinguish other people's problems and chaos that originally had nothing to do with him, ceases. One's own energy is no longer a commodity available to all comers. It now has a clear schedule that a person makes for himself. In addition, a more conscious defense of one's words begins to emerge. He is not verbose, but his words carry considerable weight. He does not expend energy on those who listen only to object. If something is not worthy of attention, he leaves it unchanged, remaining impassive because silence has ceased to be a passive state, becoming a conscious choice. He stops trying to prove his importance. The inner voice, which before was encompassed by panic at being alienated by others, becomes quieter. He no longer wastes energy on fruitless speculation, trying to anticipate which version of him will be most appealing to others. He simply remains himself, without masks, excuses, or seeking approval. Those around him sense this change. Even if it is not expressed in words, they sense the change in his tone, the confidence in his presence, and the lack of desire for a connection that is not mutual. They notice the absence of the former version of him, who often overstepped his bounds to maintain harmony. However, he doesn't become cold. He simply chooses not to waste warmth on those who only showed interest in moments of their own need. This new chapter is no longer about building walls, but about opening windows to the world. One still lets others into one's life, but the entrance is not through a back door paved with guilt, obligation, or fear of loneliness. Now, people enter through the front door of intention, respect, and reciprocity. The terms of the game have changed, and therein lies a quiet but profound truth. Once one tastes this type of inner peace, the chaos becomes unbearable. Once a person learns to enjoy his own company without feeling inferior, he stops begging for half-hearted love and empty conversations just to feel noticed. He becomes unattainable, not because he is aloof, but because he has stopped offering his soul to those who can only glide on the surface. There comes a beautiful turning point when one stops making one's presence readily available, and this is done not to punish anyone, but to protect what has been laboriously created. For when one finally succeeds in building one's own world, one begins to protect it as a shrine, but not with aggression or wall building, but with insight and wisdom. The man begins to have an epiphany, distinguishing between true connection and painful attachment. He no longer rushes to call love what is merely an ingrained habit, and stops passing off guilt, skillfully veiled under a mask of politeness, as genuine support. The conversations he once longed for become a monotonous background noise to which he only stares blankly. There is no longer any need to intervene and waste energy explaining to those who are stubbornly intent on not understanding him. This is not because of pride, but because of the clarity he has gained. He realizes that being seen by the wrong people is like being invisible. Another important change takes place. A person begins to evaluate relationships by completely different criteria. Now, it is not the duration of acquaintance or the number of moments experienced together that is important, but how he feels after communicating with a particular person, easier or harder. He begins to listen sensitively to the sensations in his own body, noticing a subtle deterioration in his condition after each interaction that previously escaped his attention. He notices how his shoulders rise when he receives a certain message, indicating internal discomfort and tension. Inner turmoil occurs when a person agrees to something that is contrary to his true desires. The path to independence begins with the ability to assert one's interests, refusing petty compromises aimed at pleasing others. After all, every such sacrifice of one's own beliefs for the sake of preserving external tranquility generates internal conflict that eventually becomes unbearable. A person realizes that the desire for approval at any cost undermines his mental balance. As a consequence, he becomes more restrained and deliberate in his reactions, which is dictated not by anger, but by the value of personal time and unwillingness to prove anything. Indifference to other people's misconceptions arises from the refusal to conform to someone else's expectations, because his main goal is to live in harmony with himself. This inner integrity attracts others, but not through external bravado or aggression, but through calmness in a world dominated by noise and focus, in a society obsessed with external vanity. Inaccessibility is a state where one becomes unapproachable, not because of deliberate concealment, but because one no longer lingers where one's inner world does not resonate. There is a pattern. Others begin to perceive the personality differently when it ceases to feel the need for their attention or approval. This is not a manifestation of coldness, but rather a change in the energetic message. Instead of pleading, "Please pay attention to me," there is now a confident statement, "I made my own choices." This subtle but significant shift speaks louder than any words. When an individual becomes unattainable, he stops broadcasting his value, stops putting his soul up for sale, hoping someone will finally notice and acquire it. He no longer strives to be chosen, no longer participates in the sale, and no longer auditions. Such a person is rooted in himself. Rooted people do not chase storms, nor do they bend to the wind in an effort to please. They stay true to themselves even when everything around them changes. It is at this point that life begins to transform, because actions are no longer dictated by a sense of scarcity. The person stops trying too hard to earn the attention of others, whether it is excessive generosity, excessive explanations, or exorbitant efforts. From now on, he knows the measure of everything, and that is enough. For the first time, it is not just words, but a deep inner conviction that is reflected in the peacefulness of each day lived. It manifests itself in the ease, simplicity, and sincerity of conversations. When the phone goes silent, it is no longer a cause for alarm or perceived as a personal insult. When one looks in the mirror, one no longer looks for faults, but rather proudly celebrates one's progress. After all, the truth is that those around him are unable to appreciate what he himself constantly belittles. For too long, he has underestimated his value, only to remain available to those who were not ready to invest in something real. But now, things have changed. Man lives in harmony with his truth, not trying to impress, but simply realizing that peace and quiet is his natural state. A persona that has long been too open to negative influences gradually realizes this truth and, as a consequence, gains a special appeal. It is important to note that this transformation does not attract everyone, but only those who are truly suited to it. We are talking about people who seek deep interaction rather than superficial entertainment, people who approach communication with a purpose rather than simply seeking convenience. By becoming unattainable, a person gets the reward she deserves. She stops wasting energy on those who drain her and begins to attract the energy that sustains and inspires her. One of the most misunderstood aspects of unattainability is that it does not imply isolation at all. Rather, it's about improving access to yourself, about prioritizing and not wasting yourself on those who only show up when they need something. This is not a manifestation of coldness, but rather a finding of warmth towards oneself, a concern for one's own well-being. After all, when a person ceases to be an easy prey, it becomes more difficult to manipulate and deplete his resources. It is worth thinking about how many times we had to neglect our own needs just to avoid the discomfort of others. How many times has it happened that an inner voice warned against something, but for the sake of preserving the relationship, this warning was ignored? How often has personal energy been given over to people who don't even bother to notice the signs of fatigue? But there is a limit to everything, and that limit is coming right now. Not because there has been a radical transformation of the personality, but because there is a realization of who the personality was before it began to adjust to the expectations of others, seeking to earn their approval. Now, when a feeling of discomfort arises, there is no attempt to rationalize the feeling, but a complete trust in it. When someone disappears in moments of personal difficulty, but reappears when bored, it is no longer taken as a compliment, but is seen as a pattern. When someone enters, the personality no longer seeks approval, but brings their own world with them and allows it to fill the space. All of this becomes possible when there is no longer a need for others to understand and respect personal boundaries. There is no longer a need for repeated explanations, and there is an end to trying to manage other people's emotions as if it were part of one's job description. The person gives those around them the right to experience their own discomfort, recognizing their distance as a given, as their inner world is no longer a matter of debate. This is not a manifestation of cruelty, but a sign of healing. True transformation is not about changing the attitudes of others, but about redefining personal tolerance. When the boundaries of tolerance undergo a change, a person's whole life is reorganized. Outdated patterns of behavior break down, superficial ties disappear, making room for authentic things and people who are genuine and open rather than confused and ambiguous. There is room for calm mornings, strong boundaries, and a version of oneself that no longer struggles to survive. It's not about shutting yourself off from love, companionship, or life. It's about becoming unavailable to chaos, codependency, and the constant need to prove your worth. A person has always been enough. It's just that at some point they stopped thinking that way and behaving accordingly. This is where the most underrated part of the process of becoming unattainable lies. The person gives up trying to prove his worth and moves on to defending it. He is no longer an emotional hotline, ready to solve other people's problems at the drop of a hat. From now on, yes does not come out of his mouth for fear of breaking the relationship. He stops over-detailing personal boundaries in the vain hope that others will understand. For the first time in his life, he comes to realize that it is not at all necessary to be understood by others to experience harmony. This is where true freedom lies, in the space between necessity and personal choice, in the peace that comes after liberation from what never rightfully belonged to him. When a person becomes unattainable, it does not mean that he is inaccessible. He is simply no longer willing to compromise. He refuses to tolerate inconsistency or encourage mediocre effort. He is no longer willing to shrink in order to maintain the ties that have held only on his self-sacrifice. There comes a point in every man's life when he realizes that he no longer intends to waste his energies on fruitless efforts. He is no longer willing to put his soul into a relationship where his contribution is not valued or noticed. There comes a satiety from situations when you have to sacrifice your inner world for the sake of fleeting intimacy, when you are used but do not see the real. And that's when there is a reassessment of values. There is no longer a desire to please or catch up with someone. A man begins to build his life based on his own needs and desires. He stops playing a role and simply becomes himself. And what is surprising is that at this very moment, when a person becomes unattainable for everything wrong and alien, he begins to attract those who really suit him. People appear who accept him for who he is, who bring peace and harmony into his life rather than chaos and confusion. These are people who are sincere in their intentions and do not require constant excuses. And if you, the reader, are listening carefully to these words right now, then you don't just hear them, you feel them. You understand what they're about. So declare your decision to stop chasing ghosts, not for anyone, but for yourself. You're not disappearing, you're just finally finding the real you. From this moment of destiny, the individual is freed from the burden of the expectations of those who have not given him space for his self-expression and development. He is no longer obliged to conform to other people's ideas of himself, if these ideas do not take into account his own needs and aspirations. This is an era when the individual has the right to form his own identity without looking back at those who have left no room for his true self. The music of freedom sounds, marking the beginning of a new chapter.